Hello, my name's Adva Saldinger, and welcome to This Week in Global Development. This week, I will be digging into the top global development stories with Shari Spiegel, who's the director of the Financing for Development Office at the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and our own global development reporter, Colum Lynch. So Shari and Colum, thank you for joining us. So Shari, I want to start with you. You had a big job helping to organize the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla. Hopefully you've had a little bit of time in the past couple of weeks to rest and recuperate after what I'm sure was a whirlwind, not only a few weeks, but months of work before that. And so I wanted to ask you, as you've had, sort of a few weeks post the conference in Sevilla, to share with us some of your reflections in terms of the takeaways. Are there, particular successes you would highlight? Are there things that were disappointing or where you wish things would have, gone farther or gone a bit differently? Other than, of course, the heat, which was out of your control.
Exactly, right. Though it did keep everybody inside. So, I would say, the meeting in Sevilla was at, as everyone knows, a really challenging time. So not only is the global macroeconomic outlook uncertain, but official development, as we were preparing, the announcements of official development assistance had fallen 7% in 2024, but 9 countries announced additional cuts in 2025. We saw trade barriers and trade tensions growing during the negotiations leading up. So it was clearly a challenging time, and that built on when we were already way off track for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and climate goals. So, and the reason that this conference was happening now was the realization that financing challenges were very much at the heart of many of the divides, even prior to the latest challenges. So, and this is in the outcome that they note that member states agreed that there's a financing gap of $4 trillion per year in developing countries alone. And that's building on annual investment growth that has fallen in half from 8% before the financial crisis in 2007 to around 4% in 2020. And we're still in a situation where 3 billion people are living in countries where governments spend more on debt interest payments than on health education combined. So there was a real clear understanding that something has to change if we're going to get back on track, and that no country is able to solve these challenges alone. So Sevilla was thought of as an opportunity to change course in a really challenging time, and at least to lay the foundation in the hope that we can change course, adopt a new financing framework, and reaffirm the role of multilateralism and building trust in our collective ability to address all the challenges. And I think it did that. So there were around 15,000 people attended. There were 50 or so heads of state, more than 200 ministers. I think the heads of all the multilateral development banks were there. There were around 470 side events. And then very important, there was a civil society forum, a business forum, 2 feminist forums, a youth forum, and really importantly, the Sevilla Platform for Action, because one of the things we didn't want was to have an agreement that just is a good or bad agreement, but that it's a paper. So the Sevilla Platform for Action, there are around 130 initiatives where coalitions of countries and institutions came together to announce initiatives to implement the agenda. And many of those initiatives are linked very, very closely to the agenda, to the outcome. So it's not just saying, well, here's an agreement, but in most UN agreements doesn't specify who's going to do it. And then countries are coming forward and saying, and institutions that we're going to do it. So very quickly, there are what we call 3 strategic steps. The first is to catalyze financing to fill the gap, including MDBs, multilateral development banks, public development banks, domestic resource mobilization, other public finance, and then leveraging private finance in a new way to do it right. Then addressing the debt and sustainable development crisis. And the third step is reforming the system to give countries to have a fairer financial system, to give developing countries more voice in the system and address holes in the global financial safety net.
I wanted to dive into one piece of that because I think one of the things that's striking, you opened by sort of setting the scene for where we stand, which is that a lot of bilateral assistance, traditional, official development assistance has been dropping. Obviously, we've seen, significant cuts here in the U.S. In terms of the budget, and we'll likely see more going forward. We got details earlier this week for how the UK will be cutting its bilateral aid budgets. And so I guess one of my questions is, do you see sort of a shift from reliance more on the bilaterals to these multilateral development banks and the public development banks, the sort of more local financiers? And how does that play out? And how does the UN then engage with those actors in a different way?
So I think that this has always been part of the financing for development agenda, that development banks have a unique role because they can lever their capital 5 times or so. And so they have the ability to borrow in the markets and lend against that. So they have a special role in funding. Now that doesn't mean that other sources and bilateral funds are not important. They are. And there's a question of what is the right role for different sources of money. And I think that's at the heart of the FFD agenda. So when is it most appropriate to use and to leverage money through multilateral development banks, the World Bank, that which also lends concessionally through IDA, and the regional development banks? When is it important to have grant finance that may come through bilaterals, and when does bilateral lending make the most sense? And to most efficiently think about how funds are used through the system. And it's a question also for the vertical funds. When does it make sense, and how do they fit together with the multilateral development banks? And then what is the role of national development banks? So we work very closely with the Finance and Commons Summit, which brings together all of the public development banks, both multilateral but also national development banks. And they are many times closer to the government, closer to the government's plans, and they can have a really important role as well in putting the government's priorities, and particularly if a government has an industrialization strategy, at the heart of the relationship. And so this question is really part of this discussion was, how does the system fit together to work well as a system? And what is the role of all of these different entities? They are all important, but they have different roles. And the same with private finance. It has an important role, but it can't replace public finance. It has a different role. And how do we use it and incentivize it appropriately for the right roles?
I know one of the things leading into Sevilla and Colum, you wrote a piece about this, was the sort of U.S. role in the negotiations and then their withdrawal from FFD, which I know was something people talked about both beforehand and at the summit. And I think post-summit, the question is, okay, the U.S. didn't sign on, but still an important actor in the financing ecosystem. So how do you engage now with the U.S.? Are you engaging with the administration on these issues? Are there places where you think they are going to be, more important actors?
Yeah, I think the U.S. like all countries in the UN, the U.S. has a very important role to play. And obviously it clearly has, it also has, it's the biggest shareholder in MDBs. It has the veto power in the IMF. So obviously it's a very important player. And they are part of the discussion. So they negotiated until the very last, in New York, when the negotiations happened, they were in the room to the very last second when they decided to disassociate. That is their choice. We hope they come back. And we hope to continue to engage with the U.S. As we move forward, as with all countries, because they have a really important role to play. And there's some, but nonetheless, I think that the Sevilla Platform for Action really highlighted that there are many ways the world and countries can move forward, even with the U.S. disassociating. And there are obviously places where the U.S. and we all need to come together, including the U.S. So I think this is a continued discussion, a continued process, and they are always looking forward to continuing discussions with all countries, including the U.S.
I know I want to come back and talk a little bit about, some next steps on some of the things that we heard in Sevilla, but I want to bring Colum into the conversation. We're talking about the U.S. You have been writing this week about some U.S. funding cuts and the impacts on the UN and UN agencies. So tell me a little bit about what we learned, the impact of the rescission that was passed and adopted by this administration will be on the UN. What agencies are going to be particularly hit by that?
Yeah, so it's taken me a long time to figure out over the last couple of years what a rescission means. So I will try to explain. Essentially, in the U.S., Congress is supposed to control the purse of government and spending. The rescission is a vehicle for the executive to try to get Congress to persuade Congress to claw back money that it has already appropriated. So in this rescission bill, which was signed into law last week by President Trump, it would claw back over $9 billion, a lot of it for foreign assistance, some of it for public broadcasting. NPR was hit funding for that public broadcasting. There's about $1 billion which was clawed back on a number of UN accounts. So, the State Department has a series of different accounts that they use to fund UN operations. It's a very complicated system. There is one account called the International Organization and Programs account, which was zeroed out in the rescissions bill. That funds not all of the agencies, but a portion. So, for instance, about $142 million in core operating funds for UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, about 80 plus million for the UN Development Program. This is not all of U.S. funding for those organizations. The U.S., I think in 23 or 24, contributed about $1.4 billion, for example, to UNICEF. Most of that money is specific programs that the UN is funding voluntarily. The core budget is basically the money that it has, a certain amount of flexibility, administrative money, but also money that allows them to respond quite rapidly to emergencies where they don't have earmarked funds. If there's a natural disaster in Pakistan, they can count on some of those funding. The Republicans have tried to indicate that this is just money going to administrators in Washington and New York, and that it doesn't impact very much their operations. But advocacy groups like the Better World Fund have argued that no, in fact, it makes it really difficult for these agencies to respond in the middle of a huge emergency. So what impact does this have? One of the other areas that was cut is about $360 million for peacekeeping operations. The overall peacekeeping costs are about $5 billion, is responsible for about 26% of that. They have not said exactly what those cuts will hit, but they've been publicly kind of attacking the UN operation in Lebanon, the UN peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So a lot of people think that those are missions that are likely to get hit. What that means is, the money is sufficient that you're not going to get those cuts with some of the political objectives the U.S. has been aiming for, like getting rid of gender programs, DEI programs, and that sort of thing. And for instance, if you're in Lebanon, you're losing a significant portion of, I think they spend about $500 million a year. You're not going to be sort of cutting along the margins. You're going to be taking out, brigades of UN peacekeepers. You're going to be, shrinking the maritime force. So a lot of the very expensive pieces of those missions are going to go. On DRC, which is kind of interesting, is that, and also is leaving us a bit puzzled, is that, if you're in the UN Security Council over the last couple of weeks, the U.S. has been quite openly supporting UN peacekeeping in the Democratic Republic and highlighting the importance of peacekeepers in maintaining stability and supporting a peace agreement that was recently signed in the White House in a meeting hosted by President Trump between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. UN peacekeeping is a part of that agreement, so it's a little bit confusing how on the one hand, the administration underscoring the importance of this, and on the other hand, the White House is calling to claw back fundings. It may suggest that there is not a unified position. It seems likely that the office, the White House Budget Office, which has been looking for cuts across the board, and the State Department apparently have a different kind of view on this. So that's kind of adding to a lot of the sort of complications and sort of questions about where is the Americans. And let's not forget that these decisions were made before the State Department has conducted its own review of international organizations and the UN. That 180-day review is supposed to be completed next month. We don't have a U.S. ambassador in New York yet, so a lot of these decisions probably are playing into the hands of the White House budget negotiators, because you don't have heavy hitters kind of making the case in the state, at the UN. So that's where we kind of stand on the decision.
And I think we heard this week that there may be a holdup in getting Mike Waltz into that position as the U.S. ambassador in the UN in Congress. So we'll see when that gets through the Senate, and if it gets through. The other piece I just wanted to touch on is that it's not only that they're clawing back money that had been appropriated for fiscal year 2025. We have seen now sort of a draft budget in the House Appropriations Committee of what they proposed for the fiscal year 2026, and that would also include really significant cuts to the accounts that you mentioned, the international organizations account and to peacekeeping. So I think, stay tuned. I think we may well see additional continued cuts to some of those key UN accounts. Obviously, still early in the process. We have to see what the Senate is going to come up with on the budget side, and it may well shift some of those funds. For example, there's no funding in the House bill for the World Bank, including IDA, which is its fund for the poorest countries. So will some of that come back? Will that be in the Senate bill? Will that lead to negotiations? There's still quite a ways to go, but I think the signals that we're seeing at this point indicate that there could be sort of continued funding pressure. And I know we've already seen a lot of UN agencies being forced to sort of make cuts as they're preparing for and sort of absorbing some of these funding changes from the U.S. I wanted to ask you, Colum, also a little bit about, how all this is playing into the discussions around UN 80 and the reform efforts at the UN to streamline things, to change things. How much is sort of the budgetary pressure playing into those conversations? And then is it really an opportunity to transform the UN, or do you think it'll be more around the margins?
So there's two different issues. One is that there's the UN80 reform, which is all about cutting back funding, 15 to 20% of staff across the board, up to around 20% of the budget for the coming year. So we have that, and then we have this separate issue, which is which the UN is talking a lot about, which is the liquidity crisis. So, and this is this is a sort of crisis that's been playing out over years. Essentially, what happens is that the U.S. right now, there's an estimate that the U.S. has gone into arrears, that it owes the UN about 1.8 billion if you count in the money from the rescissions, and that has been building up over time. So this goes back to the 1990s. You had the Congress had sort of passed legislation placing a cap on U.S. funding for peacekeeping. The U.S. feels like it pays too much for peacekeeping. They put a cap for 25% of peacekeeping, but on a calculation that the UN sort of uses to determine ability to pay, the U.S. generally gets charged somewhere over 25, 26, 27%. This year, I think it's 26.1%. So that 1, 2, 3% turns into real money in a hurry. And so there is this issue about, the U.S. not paying, what they're charged for by the UN by, which now amounts to about $1 billion. You have another issue, which is the Chinese, who now are assessed a pretty significant amount of the UN peacekeeping and regular budget. I think it's somewhere up to nearly 20% on the regular budget and over 20% on peacekeeping. And those two countries tend to pay their bills late. The U.S. traditionally is paid toward the end of the year when they're assessed usually at the beginning of the year. They pay in different tranches over the year, but essentially all these, budget fights in Washington have been even delaying the U.S. from paying, at the end of the year. So things get pushed on and on and on. And that means that the UN is basically unable to pay back foreign countries that provide peacekeepers to missions, and it complicates the UN's ability to kind of just meet its basic payments and that sort of thing. So those two things are happening. But I think, the UN sort of estimates, this UN80 project, which was, pulled together pretty rapidly. If we all remember, we were talking about a much more ambitious reform agenda last year, the Pact for the Future. And now, within months, the UN has been forced to kind of adjust and focus primarily on cutting costs. And so they anticipate, I think even for 2025, that they will have 30% less money than they had the previous year. They're likely to, that's not likely to improve in 2026. The U.S. rescissions, I think that a lot of that stuff is anticipated, and they're kind of working on trying to, prepare for that. But, it's creating this enormous, like a lot of things that we see in terms of reactions to the Trump administration, that, you see the UN internally kind of turning on itself. So you have in a lot of the agencies, lower ranking staff feel like that the leadership are prioritizing political appointees, people more senior in the UN ranks, and that lower ranking people are going to be fired in much larger percentages. The UN maintains that that's not the plan, and that they are trying to balance that. But you see that there's a lot of bitterness within the ranks towards the leadership, and then, but among some member states, there's a feeling that there's certain sympathy that this is going to be ugly, and there's really that the Secretary General has no other options. But this, a lot of this will have to be worked out by the membership, and so I find it hard to believe that that it's going to be an easy lift to get the membership to accept the Secretary General's proposals, and that it's going to be a very messy, contentious process. One of the issues that we're talking about, would involve possible mergers of different departments. And try to imagine, let's say at the UN, where you have this tradition of providing key senior, almost cabinet posts to permanent members of the Security Council. So the Chinese have the Department of Economic and Social Council. The U.S. has political affairs. The French have peacekeeping. The British have humanitarian affairs. The Russians have counterterrorism, right? So are any of the big powers willing to give up that Undersecretary General post, which gives them enormous influence in the organization? I think that's not likely. And then as you go down the food chain, you're going to find that these cuts are going to be problematic for, key mid-level powers who feel that their influence and through staffing is going to be diminished by it. So I think it could get quite ugly as we go into the later part of the year on these negotiations.
And I imagine that at the UN General Assembly high-level meetings in September, some of this will be on the agenda and be part of the discussion. Is there anything that so far in terms of what we can anticipate at UNGA, Colum?
No, the last couple of years of UNGA have really been focused on this divide between the Global South and the North on priorities, right? The Global South very much wants to focus on all these issues of reform of the international financial architecture, bringing the UN more directly into the conversations about how to deal with these issues so that they're not all decided by less democratic institutions in Washington or the multilateral banks. So I think that progress that has been made, concessions that have been made in the last couple of years are going to be clawed back. This is an administration in the U.S. which doesn't believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are worth supporting, and it openly, actively opposes them. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are at the core of what the UN is all about, right now, is trying to strike some balance between the traditional role that it's played in security and the role that it plays. I mean, the key pillars in the UN are development, human rights, and security. The U.S. says that it wants to focus more on security, and it doesn't really want to focus that much on development, and it's quite critical of the UN's human rights agenda. So, I mean, even on security, you kind of wonder how serious the U.S. is about it, because, they're talking about all of these cuts to UN peacekeeping, which is sort of at the heart of what the UN does in terms of its security agendas. So I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be a highly contentious meeting. I think a lot of these issues which have animated the Global South are going to become more heightened in this discussion. And it's going to be very interesting to see what sort of reception President Trump gets in New York. He tends to enjoy coming and, hanging out with the other world leaders. And he likes to deliver. He likes the pageantry of the UN General Assembly, which is kind of the largest gathering of world leaders anywhere on Earth. And so I think that that's going to be very interesting to see how he is, how he's addressed by the membership.
Shari, I want to come back to you because, talking about some of these priorities from Global South countries in particular, one of the things they've really pushed for is for the UN Tax Convention and for tax policies to be decided at the UN. So I'm curious, coming out of FFD, where you think things will stand with that. I know a lot of those countries hoped FFD would have maybe a stronger position on debt, or create a space at the UN to have some of those deeper conversations on debt. So on those issues, where do you think we might, are you expecting more action or discussions, or where do you think things stand?
Thank you. And just to follow up on Colum, one of Colum's last comments, that so many countries see the three pillars of security, human rights, and development as intertwined, and that the best way that once countries develop, you can't have security without development, and it's hard to have development without security. So so I think that there's still a big emphasis on the development agenda by many countries, and there will be the biennial summit in the GA week, and the high level week, which brings together the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, all of the different entities where a lot of these international financial architecture discussions are happening, to bring them together, following up on the meeting in Sevilla, to see, how the world is taking a lot of these agreements forward and implementing them. So these conversations will continue in biennial, in GA week, and let's hope that they will continue to build on the positive momentum we had in Sevilla, understanding that the U.S. had disassociated from that agreement. The issue of the tax convention, so that negotiation already started last year, and in February the meeting, the organizational meeting happened, and in fact in 2 weeks, not next week, the following week, we will have 2 weeks of negotiations in New York on the tax convention. It's already broken down. The conversations now are in a very technical stage, and they're experts who are negotiating, and they will, and a lot of this conversation, I think now, will really focus on the analytics of what a framework convention would substantively include, and what the two early protocols of cross-border services and dispute resolution would occur. So that's ongoing in a separate process. The U.S. is also disassociated from that process, but other countries are coming together and really focusing right now on a lot of the technical issues. The debt issues, there was actually a lot of movement, I think, in FfD4. So it was broken into 4 categories. One was on prevention, where there were quite a few ideas and commitments to strengthen prevention of debt crises. The second was on lowering the cost of capital, and where there was an agreement to have a facility to help countries better manage their liabilities to lower the cost of capital. And as part of the SPA, the Sevilla Platform for Action, the Spanish and the World Bank put together a swap hub and a debt swap hub, which is a starting point for having one can think of as a starting point for a bigger efforts to help countries manage the cost of borrowing and reduce the cost of borrowing. And then in terms of restructuring, when countries actually do need to restructure, there are two things that came out of this. One is a borrowers club that borrowers are setting up between themselves to strengthen their voice and peer learning, etc. And the second part is that a new process at the UN on debt. So that is, there's still a lot of discussion on what that will be, how it will get started, what the goals of that will be, and how it will be brought together. But that's something that member states will be considering after GA week. So after.
Is there anything else in terms of the, development finance agenda that we can expect at UNGA this year, or other sort of key moments that you're seeing? Obviously around the World Bank annual meetings, it's often a key moment for a lot of these actors to come together. And there have been a lot of conversations among the MDBs about changes driven in part by, G20 agenda in the past.
Yeah, I think that the big meeting will be the biennial summit. So that with the G20 there, that Brazil will be there as speaking on COP and to bring COP together. It's really a goal to bring all of these separate discussions together into one, to see how the agenda itself moves forward across all of the G7 will. So everybody, the different groups will all be represented to talk about their agendas and where they're taking it. So I think that's the other big effort will be, just like last year Brazil did this on the South African G20 presidency will be holding its its foreign affairs meeting at the UN that week as well. And so I think that, and the difference here is that these are heads of state meetings. So the annual meetings, and they're at the mostly ministerial level, and they of course have their very specific agenda. So this is the one place where at the head of state level, all these different groups come together to discuss the different agendas. And also the FfD meeting that we just had in Sevilla, it brings together all of these different entities as well. So now everyone's coming back together to reaffirm the agenda and to say, let's move forward and how we will move forward on this. So it's really, I think that's the really big moment of seeing, how these different agendas, including the MDB reform agenda, including, as I said, this question of the development cooperation architecture overall. How does one think about it on the ground and globally? So there are a lot of questions that I think the conversations will continue. And again, the question of voice and what does it mean for voice of developing countries. And the UN is a place where developing countries feel they have a voice because it's one country, one.
That's great. I think one of the things, as we were reflecting ahead of Sevilla, looking back at Addis, there were certain things where we saw quite a lot of change, but some issues where there wasn't as much movement, right? And I think there's certain areas, the emphasis on, private capital and the private sector involvement, I think has been, one, did not achieve the goals set out by Addis, which maybe were unrealistic at the time, but is seen also as kind of a sexy issue. But things like domestic resource mobilization, also we hadn't seen as much progress over that decade. So I guess, final question as we wrap up is really, what can you do on some of these key pieces, post FFD to ensure that there's actually more progress on them? So, the next time a Financing for Development conference comes around, we're not saying, oh, well, that was a goal, but the world really underachieved on that one.
Well, here are the chapters behind me. So private finance, public finance, and then the big systemic issues of trade and development and the stability of the financial system, et cetera. So yes, I completely agree that in Addis, it was probably unrealistic. We had what we used to call the blended finance train. The group would go from Paris to DC to New York and keep talking about blended finance. And I remember in so many of those conversations, because I was part of them, saying, we're getting this wrong. And in 10 years, we're going to be sitting here saying, how come none of this happened? And there was too much of an optimism that the private sector would somehow change. It wouldn't be about maximizing profits on a risk-adjusted basis, but it would be about doing good in the world. And I think that there's a much more realistic discussion happening now. So I think it's a much more honest discussion about what are the incentives of the private sector and how does one set up a framework and rules of the game that better align private sector incentives with the public goals and when it's appropriate. And that's the second part of it, is that yes, there's private investment's really important, but it's not because of the big $7 trillion, $4 trillion gap. It's because the private sector has an important role to play, and we need to get that role right. It doesn't replace public finance, can't, but it can complement it. And so I think the second big thing is that there was a very big business forum in Sevilla, and I think the discussions were much more honest and much more about what is the right role of the private sector, and how do the private and public sector fit together, and how does one ensure that they both are working together in the most appropriate way. So it's not about privatizing a public agenda. It's about where the private sector makes sense, where are there profits to be made, how does one align those profits with public goals, with public policy, and how does the system work as a whole? And to me, there's a much more honest, realistic discussion. And the discussions, if you were at the meetings in Sevilla, the side events, particularly where these discussions were happening, there were very concrete discussions about what we actually need to do. So it wasn't these big, lofty, yes, we need billions and trillions. It was trillions don't matter if they go in the wrong direction. What does it mean to get them in the right direction? What does it mean for them to be impact? And trillions don't matter if it's investing in something where the public goal that'll be too expensive for anyone to afford because that's what the private sector needs to do to get its profit. That means that it's not the right investment structure. So what are the right capital structures? What is the right way to do this? And I'm encouraged by a much more mature discussion about this that we really hope will lead to something more realistic. We work with a group called Global Investors for Sustainable Development. 30 CEOs, the Secretary General brought together to lead on the private sector side. And there's a really good conversation happening that's really realistic and honest about what the role is, and not pretending that we can, there's going to be, okay, we will solve the problem, because that, of course, not only does not work, but it also means that it's very easy to say, well, let's cut public expenditure because the private sector is there. And that's not how this works. This is about the right role for the different types of finance.
Can I just throw in a question there for Shari? I just sort of scratched down a list of all these issues where the U.S. is kind of at odds with the UN. So trade, debt, taxation, climate, financing, development in general, international regulation, corporate regulation, all these issues which came out in the negotiations on the financing for development. But are there areas where you see kind of opportunities? I mean, private sector is kind of the area on development front where at least the Americans sort of have, a plan, right? Is there any reason to think that this is an area where, there might be some upside to it, or there may be some upside to other pieces?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. The answer is yes.
You don't want to go there?
I think the private agenda is one of those agendas, and as I said, it's a question of getting that right. So, and there were quite a few, businesses, U.S. businesses that are part of this discussion because there are business opportunities involved in this. And so, yeah.
Well, I think there's probably plenty of more fodder for conversation on this particular issue. And I know it's something that I write a lot about, sort of the private sector piece. I know we saw some interesting developments on blended finance, some new platforms and things that were announced as well. And so I think hopefully we can continue this discussion. Shari and Colum, I'm sure there'll be a lot more around that biennial summit and everything that we'll see around the General Assembly week. So thank you both so much for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.